and they're very tech savvy, and their kids just give them all kinds of grief with parent control software, like, and for them to have trouble, I'm thinking it's a constant battle, and he just
I will
so
bring
frustrated.
peace to
And
this
he knows what
universe,
he's doing,
no matter the cost.
So the general population, general families, really, they're really in the firing line because their kids are really tech savvy.
They certainly are.
Yeah, but with something like this, it's pretty binary.
I am no golden god.
Interestingly, it
I am
happens
simply
at
a man who
tech,
wishes to
but
use his power
you
for
can't
good.
actually get a sim unless you're an
30 seconds
adult.
before you attack.
And I
Get
don't
ready.
think many people think about that.
Ain't looking for a fight, but ain't backing down from one neither.
And so it's quite easy to work out who is an adult and who is a minor associated with it. But at the moment, we're just asking for parents to cooperate, and that's why we started organically
The battle
just doing
starts in 5,
opening up the server
4,
so people can
3,
actually add their kids.
2,
And
1.
we've got a simple timing system on the site and
We need to
safety
stop that vehicle in its tracks.
that people can add themselves first as a parent and then add their child number. And it all just happens automatically from there. There's no you've got to do on the phone. There's no software to load or any of that. It's all done at the social media side. And the social media companies are all collecting mobile numbers anyway because that is what you use for second factor when you authenticate your account. So one of those things which is pretty obvious.
Well, I certainly...
it really becomes a good, simple natural solution.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a great focus to focus on making it a safe place for children without destroying individual privacy. Rick Richardson, Australian inventor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Joining us now is broadcaster, director and president of Octopus TV, Andrew Ebron, joining us for all the royal news, rather. Andrew, great to see you.
It's always a joy to see you, Gabriella.
We are starting with your favourite, Meghan Markle, because she's released a promo of her upcoming Netflix Christmas special featuring an appearance from her husband. Let's just take a look.
What comes in time to connect with the people we love? Embracing traditions. I like this. And making new ones. It's pretty jolly here.
The moon
It's so pretty. Easy and elegant.
It's better the next day, and everything turns red.
So festive. Being a hostess or a host is about making people feel comfortable.
You can do things that make people feel a little bit more seen.
We'll tell you how to be the best host. It's a Christmas special, but she's not calling it that. She's labeling it a holiday special. And now Harry's being featured. Will that improve the ratings?
Well, I'll tell you, they should really ginger nut capacity basic, because there he is. Back he is at long last. Has been reunited with basically not really there in the first series and hasn't completely in the second. So here he is, ready for the Christmas special.
Never fall!
But he picks it up. Meghan's very used to the limelight. Much rather than everything bits and pieces that are going on. So therefore, making people feel comfortable, telling people how to have the perfect Christmas in between the Christmas tree and all the bits and pieces. And as we say, Prince Harry making his on-screen appearance, that will undoubtedly increase the ratings. And there he was stirring a bowl. Now, you might remember that back in 2019, he missed out on the fourth generation of the Cosmos Bowl stirring that Her Majesty, the late Majesty, the Queen had. And they had Prince Charles was there. There was also Prince William, the young Prince George. And this was the preparation that they did. Harry was unfortunately absent for that, but he's certainly going to be there for this particular series. The other interesting thing is the timing when this trailer was released. I was in Paris at the time. I was invited to see a superb concert by the elder Prince who was supporting Simply Red celebrating 40 years. I was in Paris watching this release. What's going on over here is Prince William wonderful Netflix show, which coincided terribly upstage by Taylor Swift's announcement of her engagement. So the timing of these things is always extraordinary.
Oh, it certainly is. Now, Meghan, would you believe it, has been dubbed the Duchess of Delusion after quote a deeply uncool move. Now, this is after it's been revealed that Meghan was announced royalty even in semi-formal settings. Now, this was revealed in Harper's Bazaar. Andrew, it is absolutely extraordinary. What do you make of this?
Well, I have never missed an avalanche of
Supernova!
I've been deeply uncooled by a world not as good as on your program.
No,
Interview, Harper and it's basically the grand brownstone up at East Side that belongs to one of Meghan's friends. All the time, it's just the two of them in the house. There was the house manager announced, however, Meghan, it's called the announcement, they're just missing the fanfare to go with it. And then Meghan would appear. You remember those laws sort of so there was a bit over the top. She clearly loved those titles.
Shield will serve you well.
And she called Meghan the Duchess of Delusion, she said. And I'll read you what she said. She said, "You deeply uncool. So much of Meghan's title meaning nothing. Clearly it means everything to her. The only thing aside from her ever-present victimhood that makes her feel validated, worthy, important, what a ridiculous empty person she is. How deeply uncool." Some assistance, please. Well, there we go. But that's one of them.
a little bit over the top. I think plenty of people would maybe agree with that new title. Delusion, maybe a more fitting title for Meghan Markle. Look, we're staying on her. One more topic to get through with Meghan Markle. She shared an insight into her morning routine. It's a very Instagram of her, isn't it? She shared tips for hosting overnight guests and
Born again!
I like having some of the fruit full and the rest favorite things for breakfast with our food is having tea. So one of two things, if you have just a great quiche and go to the store and make it yourself, you can leave it out if you know people are going to wake up right around now. Otherwise, I would just write a little note that says, "Morning, help yourselves, quiche in the oven." And just presenting it in a way that feels a little bit more enticing, and people can wake up in the morning and feel cared for.
Andrew, insightful stuff there. You can either leave the quiche in the oven, or you can either leave it out, or you could leave a note. I mean, a lot of helpful tips from Meghan Markle.
Very quiche me quick, absolutely. you gotta do it. I love my quiches warm, fresh out of the oven. It's got to be good. Well, the turkeys gobble and waddle have just received the president's pardon, haven't they? Well,
Pick your
there's
hero.
a couple of turkeys
Or
over
villain.
at Montecito
I'm not judging.
Talking about this sort of stuff. Lots and lots of things. So this is basically how to look after your guests. And we've got their Thanksgiving coming up tomorrow, in fact, Thursday. And what
Make
they're going
way
to do,
for
these
the
are
king of
special
teas.
tips she also gave for hosting these overnight guests. And she talks about creating stations. So basically your guests can help themselves, not just to the quiche, but to the other things indeed. Well, the stations they might want to create are the stations they can catch the train out of very, very quickly. if she gets all that sort of pretentious stuff. She's basically
looking
a brand signature.
They ain't backing down from
It's
what's
an
easy.
infomercial, if you like, because lots of her wonderful products are featured throughout all of this.
30
But
seconds
one of the
before you
wonderful
attack.
revelations
Get
that I
ready.
liked actually was the thing about Archie and Lilibet and how they love
yourself out
waffles. And apparently the late Queen's personal waffle maker, she basically gave them. She was asking Harry what Archie likes for Christmas. And in 2021, it was revealed on the James Corden show that Prince Harry spoke to the late Queen and about
The
a
battle
thoughtful
starts in
present and
5,
said that Archie
4,
really loves waffles.
3,
He would like
2,
a waffle maker.
1.
So that's what he has, and we saw
All you need to
a
do
wonderful
is
image
capture the
of
mission
some
area.
green waffles
Got it?
being
born
made
to
for some
change
Patrick's
humanity.
Day,
There's a
and so on
dark
and so
living
forth.
in
But
my
you
time has
guarantee
come.
there's going to be a lot more waffles in this particular series.
Okay, look, I lied to you. I said we were moving on to Meghan Markle after the Thanksgiving segment. We've got one more topic to
time
address
I need
because there's been
healing.
some controversy over a green dress that Meghan Markle put on during this trailer of her new series. And a source has told KBC that Meghan Markle allegedly walked away from a 2022 variety cover shoot with a $1,695 green gown because it was all part of archiving her clothes as a royal. What's happened here, Andrew?
Well, what I like about the situation, Meghan Markle gown
cosmos heals.
So what happens is, it was, as you say, it was a 2020 variety cover shoot. There was a $1,695 green gown. It was all about apparently archiving clothes as a royal, because that's what you have to do as a royal, to make sure that you remember what you wore. The reason it's coming back now is because it appeared in that promotional video that you've just seen with Lana Meghan holiday celebration. And lots of people pointed out on social media, we spotted that
Something seems
beforehand.
fishy
There was also in
You see these stars?
she was spotted in a black and white strapless midi dress, which was designed by Chanel during a date night with Prince
We must get to
Harry's Private
safety.
Club, NYC Club. Shay Margot. Apparently she'd worn that design piece to a photo shoot in 2022 for the film.
Capture
So the suggestion was that she walked off the
Keep
set
going.
without asking permission for it. But something she said, as a spokesperson, commented on how the situation of any items were taken without the full knowledge and stylist or the respective team was categorically false. The rep also told us that items were done so massive.
I feel better already.
The suggestion that she nicked it was totally unfair, but certainly it was the one that appeared in the photo shoot, and certainly well done to all those people who spotted to make a reappearance in this video.
Now, the royal family is gearing up for a tradition to celebrate America's 250th birthday next year, but there's of course speculation that there will be no reunion with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. They're reportedly set to be left out in the cold, according to sources that told Page Six. So, Andrew, tell us about this trip. Prince William and Princess Catherine, they're expected to join in the historic celebrations in July, but no reunion, apparently.
Absolute 250th birthday bash for America. Hurrah! As you know, we had a very successful time with Trump's visit to Windsor Castle. I was outside waving the power hour
Where
flag,
there is
as
evil
you know,
in this
and reporting
universe,
on that.
I will
and
be
during that
there to
visit,
balance it.
the President Trump invited King Charles and Camilla and the royal family to come over for a visit to celebrate the 250th anniversary. That is going to be
30
a
seconds before
wonderful
you attack.
tour.
Get ready.
Obviously hoping that the King is well enough because he's obviously got his health scared and so on and so forth. But they have been invited for the state visit in April, and they're gearing up for this spangled trip to celebrate the 250th birthday. But Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are set to be left out in the cold, lots of people are saying. Maybe because they are no longer working royals. That's the main sort of reason they're not going to be there. So the declaration of independence, well, they declare themselves independent from the working royals, and as a result, there is going to be a result of being left out.
We succeed this day.
But you can guarantee we're going to hear all about it.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, Meghan Markle has been promoting her new Netflix series and promoting down on Instagram. Princess Catherine has made a very personal statement showing support for people battling addiction. She said that she wanted to end the stigma surrounding addiction. The Prince of Wales marked Addiction Awareness Week in the UK, showing support for people battling addiction and called on others to do the same. And it's just about
Mission area is yours.
I love this. But guys, we have done it. Share a spotlight on she made a very powerful speech. I'll just give you a couple of excerpts of it. This Addiction Awareness Week, I am always very glad to lend my support to this hugely important campaign. Through my role as patron of the Forward Trust, we've been humbling to see significant progress made to
This ends now.
tackle the stigma surrounding but there remains much more to do. Addiction is not a choice, she continues, or a personal failing, but a complex mental health already. To be met with empathy and support. But still, even now in 2025, the cosmos heals. There is fear, shame, and judgment. This needs to change. Well done for her for calling that out. And basically, this is the Forward Trust, the British charity that helps people with drug and alcohol dependence. She's been the royal patron since June 2021. And she signed this just that her full name. And it really is returning
I am ready to put on a show.
Briefly to deal with her cancer battle. She announced that it's not treatment for communications but basically she's been in September at the moment she's cancer-free.
The Amazing Spider-Man!
I want us to be the generation that talks about these things, so the next generation doesn't take the treatment. So congratulations again.
Born again!
Absolutely. The Princess of Wales has also launched a large-scale research project on the technocrats that she believes is damaging their parents' relationships with children. So the World Foundation says more evidence is needed about what causes people to turn to digital devices rather than engage in family life and to help really combat this problem. So this foundation is going to donate £100,000 to a study which it hopes will lead change by offering practical solutions for parents. Look, another important cause here, Andrew. What can you tell us about this?
Well, it's the first thing we touch in the morning and the last thing we touch at night. It's not our loved ones, but these things, isn't it? And that's the problem. People are addicted. And what she's saying is that it focuses for wrecking parent and childhood bonds. She launched this large-scale research project called this Technoference, which she wants to sort of basically guard against the interference by technology in people's lives. She said more evidence is needed about what causes people to turn to digital devices rather than engage in family life. And you see many people now in restaurants, in shops, and even sitting around the family tables are all glued to their screens rather than engaging in conversation. I'm sure you see that all the time. It's extraordinary how people date nowadays. They don't really know how to communicate. They don't know how to talk and so on and so forth. So she said that a whole generation, I support on this as well, is more isolated, more lonely, and less equipped to form those warm, meaningful relationships that were the basis of a happy, healthy life.
Pick your
you might
hero.
remember last
Or
week she
villain.
urged
I'm not
business
judging.
leaders to prioritize time and tenderness alongside profit and success, saying that she believed in restoring the dignity to the quiet, often invisible work of caring, of loving well. So it is interesting. I've spoken previously about the Wales' children. And none of them have phones. 12-year-old Prince George, apparently, William spoke about this. Maybe get a dumb phone, not a smartphone.
Make way for the king of teams.
Which he might need when he starts secondary school. It's an ongoing conflict between them because obviously a lot of their
Time to see if your boy Gambit can steal us a win.
That this is what they want them to, not be digitally dependent at this age. It was interesting, they refer to a new
30
survey
seconds before you attack.
which has said that
Get
62%
ready.
of those in the UK adults said that they were sometimes, often, or always distracted by phones. Survey on that sort of basis, or digital devices while spending time with the family. So again, I would absolutely endorse this sort of stuff. The more we can make sure people are not digitally dependent, the better. And so well done for this scandal yet again.
Let's turn to the fallout with Andrew,
battle starts
formerly
in
known
5,
as Prince Andrew,
4,
and now a
3,
council in Northern
2,
Ireland has
1.
begun work to change the name
All
of
you
the
need to do
street,
is capture the
named
mission
after
area.
Andrew
Got it?
Mountbatten Windsor. So Prince Andrew Way is going to be renamed, but Andrew, the council warns it's not going to be straightforward.
Well, Prince Andrew's on the way, I can tell you what they want. So this is the Mid and East Antrim Council in Northern Ireland. They've begun work to change the name. Lots of residents and they don't want to be called Prince Andrew Way. So that's going to happen. And what happens is there's slight complications because utility bills and so on and so forth. They're all dependent on the aggressive life. So what they've warned about, there will be some changes, but there will be those sort of impacts accordingly. Here's the sort of bureaucratic bureaucratic nightmare as a result of it. I mentioned previously as well that it's very near to me with the Duke of York pub, which used to have a picture of Prince Andrew outside. That has been few months, and people are basically revisiting on that sort of basis. But there are a few Prince Andrew ways around.
They should keep us safe.
This should limit any damage. And all of those are currently revisiting
coming back
they
for
should
more.
call it.
Just finally on Fergie, Sarah Ferguson is tipped to take part in a bombshell interview. The ex-Duchess is said to have an appetite for revenge. She's reportedly not happy with King Charles's decision to evict her and her ex-husband Andrew Mountbatten Windsor from the Royal Lodge, of course, amid the scandal involving their connection to Jeffrey Epstein. Andrew, what can you tell us about this? Is Fergie going to sit down for a bombshell?
Well, I think if you offered her a lot of money to come to the next week, she might feel better already. But no, she's certainly not happy.
Yeah, we got your back.
She's lived there for a long time, this Royal Lodge, what we've got talking about. They're going to be reached out and predicted something about half of the now. Discussing where she may move next, and we talked about that. But clearly, money's going to be an issue. It always has been with and we talked about various things with Epstein. She had to borrow money from him. He had £15,000 to pay
The next
somebody
version
off.
of me I meet
And that as a result of when all the sort of email leaks and so on and so forth. But she's in a terrible state at the moment, not least both mentally, which is awful, but also financially. So there is talk that a number of people are sort of swirling around her.
Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man!
And there's every possibility that she
Rise, my friend!
sign up even for Oprah again. $1 million, I know that but less than that. The big problem for all of this is obviously the king, because his whole reign has now been tarnished with this particular scandal. He wants to move on, so they can work on that sort of basis. So we hope that there will be good news with his brothers that we've been very close to around the world. And William's doing lots of great things as well.
Again!
Absolutely. Andrew Eaglehorn, royal broadcaster and barrister, and of course president of Octopus TV. Thank you so much for your time with us on Power Hour. So good to talk to you.
We gotta look out for one another.
That is Power Hour. Thank you for your company. We'll see you tomorrow. Make sure you subscribe to Sky News Australia.
Your powers are mine!
We are undefeatable!
Never fall!
We are undefeatable!
Welcome to Parliament House in Canberra for a very special event being broadcast live on Sky News around the country. And this happens to be in one of the Senate committee rooms of Parliament House in Canberra. And literally below our feet right now is the Prime Minister and Treasurer's Economic and Productivity Roundtable. But basically because of the energetic efforts of Matt Canavan, Senator Matt Canavan, the National Senator, he decided to bring together a real roundtable about productivity. And so you'll hear from some of the leading experts in Australia, not only on our economy, but also on productivity today about what really needs to happen. This is quite different to the roundtable that's taking place downstairs for a few reasons. Number one, it's being broadcast. Downstairs, there are no cameras. In fact, even in this room, there are mobile phones. Downstairs, there are no mobile phones. They are locked in. You don't know what's saying. So much for open government, you might argue, but really here you are going to find out exactly what needs to be done to get this country moving again. The real conversation is about productivity, probably stimulated because the Reserve Bank did not cut interest rates as quickly as the government might otherwise have wanted. And so as a result, all of a sudden, the word productivity became the top of everybody's minds. But the reality is there's a lot of other issues in Australia, competitiveness being one of those. Australia right now is seeing capital leaving this country simply because the country, it would seem, is not competitive enough. That means energy prices, that means taxes, that means industrial relations. A lot of things which even the roundtable downstairs does does not dare to discuss. So we have, as I say, a really stellar group of people in this room today. But the person who brought everybody together is Senator Matt Canavan, and so I think it's appropriate that we start and hear from him first. Matt.
Thank you very much, Ross, and thank you for all coming along today at such short notice. Thank you very much for Sky for broadcasting this, because I do believe that the Australian people deserve frank discussion about the economic policy our country is in and how and they deserve to hear how those problems have come about. Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man! We have some of the best and brightest economic minds in the country here today, business leaders. I want to thank you all for coming together at short notice. I had this idea just a week ago. I was having breakfast with Jerry Holland there, and we were both lamenting the fact, after having read the papers for this round table, that there was barely a mention of some of the major issues facing our country. There was no mention of the tripling of electricity prices that have occurred in the past years. There was no mention of the industrial relations morass that has caused our construction sector to find it so difficult now. And there's no mention of the government spending outbreak we've seen that is itself crowding out private investment. And so we had this idea and we called people, and I think a lot of people around the country are thinking that the government's productivity roundtable doesn't seem to be all up to right now. And so thank you all for coming out. I want to particularly thank Gary Banks, the former chair of the Productivity Commission, for coming. I worked with Gary 20 years ago on a report into the last major economic reforms that we did as a country, the national competition policy reforms. And we had the job of assessing the impact of those reforms were. It's hard to remember, but back then I pulled out a report this morning, this report that we did. From 1990 to 2004, electricity prices fell by 19%. Actually fell. We actually got in there and made some hard decisions, and we took off. We lowered the cost of living for Australian people, and of course helped Australian businesses compete with the world. Of course, since then we've lost complete control of electricity prices, and when we assessed the impact of those reforms, it was that reduction in electricity prices which generated the biggest benefits for consumer welfare. And so I think we've got to focus on those real issues. We've got to return to that discussion. We are not going to, in my view, fix our productivity crisis if we cannot lower energy prices. I'm hoping for a frank and open discussion today. Unlike the secret round table downstairs, there are no restrictions on what people say.
Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man!
My only rule is that could we please avoid any corporate gobbledygook? Can we just speak plainly? Because plainly, the economic conditions of this country are not good enough, and we're only going to get out by speaking plainly, honestly and frankly, and tackling these challenges before they get a lot worse. So thank you again, Ross, and thank you everybody again for being here. I really look forward to a great discussion today.
Right, thank you so much, Matt. I should have also mentioned right at the outset that Matt Canavan did work for the Productivity Commission. And so hence that might be the reason why perhaps one voice that has not been heard in all this conversation about productivity for a long time is Gary Banks, the former chair of the Productivity Commission. Now the Dean and also the Chief Executive of ANZOG, the Australian New Zealand School of Government. And I think a lot of people will be wanting to hear his own views about the way in which Australia could improve what is a woeful decade of productivity growth, which has really led to the diminishing of people's well-being, their lifestyle, and indeed perhaps their standard of living. Gary, welcome, and we'll go to you next.
Pretty much, Ross. I should say that I'm no longer with ANZOG. For a long time, people saying, "Are you retired?" I didn't know what to say, but I think I can say now, yes, I am. But it's a bit like Groundhog Day coming back into this committee room with a few more cameras maybe than the last time I was here. Well, the Productivity Commission still keeps reminding us productivity growth's accounted for at least 80% of the increase in per capita income in Australia since mid-century. It'll need to be the main determinant, obviously, of future living standards as well. But productivity has essentially gone from nowhere for much of this new century. Has become a matter of general concern, if not consternation. Even more concerning, I think, is the expectation which is embedded in the Treasury's latest for the generation report of a much diminished future rate of productivity growth compared to what it was in the past, and the Reserve Bank has, in rather loud terms, just underlined that for us all. And of course that'll bring with it a comparable diminution in income growth and thus living standards in the longer term. We're maybe looking forward to looking backward in a way to a future generation which is less well off than its parents, and it may be happening right now. So the challenge we face is that the conditions for sustained improvement don't exist, despite government narratives to the contrary. A lot of public policy, and indeed much so-called reform, is working against the productivity objective, and increasingly so. And in broad terms, policies that promote cost-conscious and innovative behaviour, that enhance access to human capital, efficient infrastructure services, better performing enterprises prevailing over weaker ones, all of those could be called pro-productivity, and those having the opposite effect are anti-productivity.
This is where it led.
Now, many of the latter, as you'd all know, involve regulations. Regulations that either distort business decisions as well as risks, that stifle innovation, that involve costs. Those influences also tend to inhibit private investment, which again mechanism, a key mechanism for productivity itself. So,
you thought you got rid of me?
So let me just... I had one of those mornings where my actual notes disappeared, and I'm relying on my iPad to back me up.
Now you do the same for me.
Well, unfortunately, attention to regulation has been more about increasing it, I think, than reducing it or improving it. And the government's productivity agenda is mainly a spending agenda, and you could say a spending more agenda. It's not one that involves, to date anyway, the kind of regulatory reforms that are needed. Now, energy and labour markets, two areas of crucial importance to Australia's economic performance, have been particular casualties
By the eye of Agamotto!
In the case of energy, which you're going to hear a lot more about in the next session, rather than leveraging the power of markets to discover least cost means of reducing emissions Australia-wide, governments have opted for ad hoc subsidies and regulatory measures without regard for their widely differing costs and significant distortionary effects on resource allocation. They've adopted targets for emissions and renewables without any clear idea of how to achieve them. And in so doing, they've assisted technologies that cannot deliver reliable power while suppressing those that could. The result is an increasingly dysfunctional energy system requiring far more capital to produce far less reliable power. It's the antithesis of the pro-productivity policy government persists presented as. Abundant low-cost energy has traditionally played an important role as an economy in offsetting the detrimental impact on industry performance of Australia's rigid, high-cost labour market. Not only is it no longer possible for energy to play this role, after a period of greater flexibility that began with the Hawke and Peltier reforms, regulatory impediments in the workplace have also been increasing again. For example, on top of existing productivity provisions, legislative provisions to restore industry-wide bargaining and to control non-permanent, read non-unionised work arrangements will diminish the scope for the win-win enterprise deals that are needed and see more production decision-making being influenced by the regulator. This will inhibit innovation, job creation and growth. Yet, of course, as we know, workplace regulation is not being discussed on the floor below, despite Treasury's previously expressed concern about the effect of restrictive labour market regulation on the dynamism that they see as the key to productivity growth. A third area where government policy has gone backwards with respect to economic efficiency and productivity is taxation. There are too many taxes, too many of which harm productive endeavour, incentives reduced, capability diminished, and human and capital resources are diverted to less productive uses or indeed overseas. Reforms that would improve things, including by reducing what Paul Keating's described as the punitive taxation of income, have been laid out in various reports over the years. But, and including, of course, a whole day tomorrow in the round table, the government's round table in the other room. But reducing the pressure on the taxation system by trimming public expenditure itself is rarely mentioned. Yet the potential gains from lower deadweight costs of taxation and more efficient service provision are considerable. The diversion of resources to the public sector has been a major contributor to the decline in productivity growth in Australia, and you'll have all seen the same reports that I've seen about that. Now, most parts of the public sector not only have lower productivity, but they have inherently slower productivity growth. And this reflects not just greater labour intensity of the services concerned, but weaker incentives to use resources in a cost-effective way and to pursue cost-reducing innovations. Yet a key strand of the government's productivity agenda is to further promote the scale and reach of the burgeoning care economy, so-called. In reality, of course, this will do little for national productivity. In fact, it'll diminish it. What it will do, of course, is increase the number of people employed in the non-market economy. And again, you'll see the numbers on that, which are staggering, the high proportion of total job creation that's being created with taxpayers' money. Public sector waste and the loss of economy-wide growth potential associated with it, of course, not confined to the caring sector. Indeed, the term white elephant these days is synonymous with big publicly financed infrastructure projects that, as a first approximation, never come in on time or on budget. Such projects, and there are plenty of them, do not just waste resources, they crowd out other projects in both the private and the public sectors, projects that could bring benefits to society. Victoria's big build, I live in Melbourne these days, has drained resources otherwise available to Victoria's building and construction sector, for example, at a time of hugely unmet demand for housing. When it comes to large-scale private projects, a range of regulatory obstacles are candidates for reform. A recent Productivity Commission report has laid them out at length, but there's been little or no progress in ameliorating them. Well, in view of all this, it's perhaps unsurprising that productivity has gone from sluggish to depressive, and investment with it, and that some key businesses have moved offshore, and indeed insolvencies are historically high. The impacts of higher costs and reduced labour market flexibility on competitiveness are likely to be particularly damaging for manufacturing. It's therefore a bit ironic that, having ignored or added to such impediments, the government is embarking on a Future Made in Australia pitch for Australia to become a leader in green manufacturing. Even more ironic is the recognition that this could only be achieved with substantial subsidies from the taxpayer. Now, to someone who spent much of his career at the Productivity Commission and its predecessors, the sense of déjà vu is palpable. What did Yogi Berra say? Déjà vu all over again. Well, I guess the typical experience from the past has been that the risk of government sponsoring businesses will never be internationally competitive, and creating a long-term dependency on public support at significant cost to the wider community. I think it was George Santayana who remarked on the perils of not heeding the lessons of history. Seeking to obtain benefits to society through subsidies for particular firms or industries, including in the form of tax concession, has proven a fool's errand, a term for which I got into a little bit of trouble with the Prime Minister the last time I said it. But this is particularly true where the competitive fundamentals are lacking. Now, while it's asserted that this time the government's approach will be, quote, more nuanced and disciplined, the basis for that is unclear, to say the least. None of the schemes appear to have had the benefit of the sort of evidence-based approach they need. Just declaring that an initiative is in the national interest does not make it so. And I'll end there. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary. I mean, we'll have discussion about this very shortly because there's so many issues that Gary has raised there which really go to the heart of the issues that the Australian economy genuinely has right now. But in order to basically pay for some of the measures that the government has implemented, the NDIS being one, childcare subsidies being another, so many others, some of which clearly are necessary with a workforce where you've now got female participation at the record highs, which is a good thing because you're not wasting education. But it has to be paid for. And of course, some suggest the way to make Australia a better country is to increase taxation or to, shall I say, change taxation. Many of those ideas come out of our federal treasury. So it might be appropriate, therefore, that we go to somebody from Treasury or formerly from Treasury. David Pearl was the Assistant Secretary at Treasury. He's an economist and now a full-time writer and commentator. Made very strong comments in the media earlier this week, and so I'll move it across to David Pearl. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ross, and to Sky for televising this, and Matt Canavan, whose brainchild this event was. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at today's meeting. In contrast to the stage-managed, confected event the government is holding in this building, as Matt says, this promises to be a worthwhile, frank and transparent discussion of ideas where the Australian people can see and hear and reflect on what we're talking about today. I'll talk today a little bit about the whole of economy dimension of productivity because I'm conscious that we have outstanding sectoral experts in the room. And I also want to talk a little bit about the institutions, the economic institutions that played such an important role in previous economic reforms. As you all know, only last week the Reserve Bank downgraded its medium-term productivity growth assumption by 30% from 1 to 0.7%. And if realised, this will cap our economy's sustainable speed limit to a paltry 2% each year.
You'll need a
Yet even this write-down remains
one.
wildly optimistic, given that, as you all know, labour productivity has flatlined in this country since 2016. Now, is Australia's poor productivity performance unique in the rich world? Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese and even Treasury would like you to believe that's true. Now, while it's not unique, the slow-growth Western European economies find themselves in a deep malaise like us. Let's not forget that only a few decades ago we were streets ahead of them. In the late 1990s, labour productivity grew at an annual rate of 2.3% each year in this country. We were back then a truly exceptional pro-growth, pro-aspiration economy where markets, not bureaucrats, allocated resources, governments lived within their means and believed in cutting taxes, and where the vulnerable were looked after with targeted, means-tested safety nets. It was a time when both major parties channeled Milton Friedman, but with a social conscience. But we've had a spectacular fall from economic grace. If we continue along this trajectory, Paul Keating's Banana Republic prophecy will be realised, and far sooner than we think. The first step in resting this slide is to correctly identify the nature of the problem. I wrote about problem definitions influencing policy in the Australian on the weekend. That plays an enormous role in Treasury and in round cabinet tables, as some of you would know. Define the problem and get the favoured solution. But let's look at this and be really clear, and let's dispense with the myths and misconceptions some of those at the government's round table are putting out there. Our productivity crisis cannot be blamed on measurement errors in the care economy. It cannot be blamed on the slow uptake of technological advances or progressive economists' favourite bogeyman, malign oligopolies which undermine competition and dynamism. That ideological anti-big end of town view was a late 19th century, early 20th century view. It's now fashionable again. It's fallen out of fashion in the US, but the Australian econocrats and many left-wing think tanks, including E61 and Grattan, still perpetuate it. And nor can we attribute our fall from economic grace simplistically to low business investment, although I accept that's part of the issue. For productivity, as Matt and I discussed the other day, it's the quality, not the quantity of investment that matters. It's the return it yields, determined by markets and prices, not bureaucrats. And that's an element of productivity. It's the value your accumulated factors generate, not output per se. The Soviet Union had enormous productivity producing combine harvesters, but it had no value. The truth is that we have deliberately chosen the economic purgatory habit. I want to say that again. We've deliberately chosen it. It's not an act of God. It's not an accident. It's not due to the 24-hour media cycle and gutless politicians. We chose it as a society. In the early part of this century, we dispensed with the world-leading economic model Paul Keating, Howard and Costello championed and set out to replace it with something entirely different. While this new dispensation was billed as a progressive one, it is in fact deeply and obviously regressive. It's not new, it's not untested, it's something we've seen before and which manifestly has failed. And it has failed wherever it's been tried. It's a revival of failed policies and fraudulent economic beliefs of our pre-reform
Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man!
Attached. Back then, the rallying cry was protection for all, justifying an economy-wide network of tariffs, quotas, subsidies and price rigging. Today, we impose those very same policies under the banner of net zero. Back then, in the area of workplace relations, we're reliving the bad old 70s, as you all know, where unions dictate the terms, including in the government's roundtable, and multi-enterprise bargaining is back in vogue. And channeling Gough Whitlam, we have removed all fiscal constraints on government, something that Phil Lowe talked about yesterday, embracing unaffordable universal welfare programs and sneering, including in the Treasury and including some recent Treasury secretaries, I might add, sneering at the notion of balanced budgets. Both major parties are equally to blame for this, but I can date the Labor Party's loss of its economic conscience. In 1996, the newly minted opposition leader Kim Beazley appeared on the cover of the Business Review Weekly. You might remember that now, the front magazine. He was beaming, and one of his advisors was Wayne Swan. And the headline of that magazine said, "Keating is dead. Labour's moved on to redress his fate."
I am ready to put on a show!
Never miss!
Good sense. Unfortunately, while Howard continued the reform tradition, at least in the first part of this administration, and I think Tony Abbott had good intentions, both major parties, and I want to stress this, both major parties are to blame for our economic retreat. Both have embraced the discredited, regressive, but they call progressive, economic prescriptions from the past. Not least the last
With the
election.
amazing
So how do we turn
Spider-Man!
the corner? It starts by posing a simple question. What kind of society and economy do we want to be? Do we want to be a high taxation, cradle-to-grave welfare economy where resources are allocated by bureaucrats, not markets, and growth is deliberately constrained under the rallying cry of net zero, which is a rationing of economic growth? Any honest Treasury person or environmental campaigner would accept that. You ration emissions, you ration growth. There's no breakthrough silver bullet technological solution. The other choice, do we want to be a pro-growth, aspirational economy where markets, guided by consumers, occupy centre stage and with government playing a critical role, but a secondary and supportive one, setting the rules of the game, helping those who are genuinely in need. As I've argued before, this is not a narrow technocratic choice. It's not a case of politicians deciding for one or the other. It's a societal choice. And in fact, it requires considering our social contract. What's our notion of fairness? In the 80s and 90s, the notion of fairness was equality of opportunity. If you were born in the western suburbs of Sydney and had a good education, you would benefit from low marginal tax rates. And if you were successful and ended up in the eastern suburbs, in the Paul Keating and John Howard's Australia, you were celebrated. It wasn't seen as a zero-sum game, as some kind of extraction of value and lifestyle from other people. But today our notion of fairness is equality of outcomes, which means massive government redistribution. Can't mean anything else than that. How much faith do we have in bureaucrats and policymakers? Do we take a sceptical view of those who regulate our economy and accept that they have their own interests? They want bigger powers, they want bigger budgets, they like to manipulate their politics. Or do we think that they are unimpeachable public servants who are missing economic? I think in Australia, more than any other Western country, and I've lived in France and Britain and the US, we have a very naive view of bureaucrats and regulators. We're going to talk about red tape later with Daniel and his colleague. Very clear on that, and the public has to understand that as well. Let me say a few words before I wind up. I'm conscious of the time about the role of our economic institutions, including the Treasury, where I worked for 2 decades in the productivity division. The reform task Hawke and Howard faced would have been far more difficult, if not impossible, without the sound advice, credible analysis and professional integrity of these bodies. While the Treasury is not and never has been independent of government, it never hesitated back then to tell ministers what they needed to know rather than what they wanted to hear. We prided ourselves on our whole of economy focus and consistently advocated in private discussions with ministers, both Labor and Coalition, for lower and flatter income taxes, balanced budgets, targeted safety nets, free trade and undistorted markets. We're informed not by ideology, but rational economics and common sense. Over recent decades, both institutions have been colonised, and I use that word advisedly, and compromised by progressive economic ideology, just as so many of our institutions have. The rot started at the top, not at the working level. Discussion papers these bodies issued for the Reform Round Table lacked economic rigour and spruiked highly questionable government policies and accomplishments. In her press club speech, Danielle Wood, the chair of the PC, called on the political class to adopt the growth
with the amazing
and be aware of inescapable policy trade-offs. It ignored net zero energy policies completely we have imposed on ourselves, even describing it as an economic prize. High on the to-do list for our next reforming government, Labor or Coalition, must be a complete overhaul of these institutions. Let me end on a more optimistic note. While the task of overturning a failed economic is a daunting one, we succeeded in doing it before. Let's not forget that. Policy revolutions must start somewhere, however, as we discovered in 1983 when Bob Hawke floated the dynamo. We've got to rip the band-aid off and hope that that creates momentum. What are the achievable initial steps that can be taken, while not silver bullets in themselves, but might build momentum for wider changes? Now, this is not meant to be sounding glib. I've thought about this, and it doesn't exhaust other possibilities. First, the pernicious practice of bracket creep must be outlawed, which not only is a regressive tax, but guarantees lazy governments additional revenue every year, feeding the Canberra beast. I spent 20 years in Treasury. Treasury as a revenue department loves bracket creep. Second, in order to fund needed significant income tax cuts, and let's take Paul Keating's 37% or 38% top marginal rate as a benchmark, federal spending must be reduced by 4 percentage points of GDP, just as Paul Keating achieved in the late 1980s. We can phase in the changes, but it has to be linked to meaningful tax cuts, or it does not have public support. A much more targeted NDIS should be the first cab off the rank. Maybe it needs to be closed to new members and grandfathered, and its eligibility has to be wound right back to profound disabilities. Third, just as Keating deregulated our financial system, we must do the same to our centrally planned energy market. I'm not ignoring industrial relations, but I think the energy market is the burning platform, and Aidan's going to talk about that. Freeing ourselves from the pointless economic straitjacket of net zero and unlocking the supply potential of our economy. I was at the OECD in the late 90s and we discussed climate change policy, and we all agreed around the table that cutting emissions is an imposed economic cost. The idea of international agreements was to share that cost equally. The Paris Accord, unlike Kyoto, has no credible mechanism at all to enforce production targets, and 60% of people are not enforced. But if you're concerned about climate change, the rational response is adaptation. If we know one thing about the government's round table, and I've gone over and I'm going to stop here, Ross, but this is my last thought, It is that it will seek to take us in the opposite direction, serving only to deepen our productivity malaise. Paul Kelly this morning said that the government's progressive economic agenda was an experiment and it will be judged on whether it succeeds or it fails. I respectfully disagree with him. It's not an experiment. It's a reversion to something facts show failed in the past. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that. Rightio, so we move along now, and in this case we go to, of all places, Vietnam, where we find Henry Ergas, who formerly was, of course, an economist with the OECD, worked with them in Paris. He was responsible for adjustment issues, was accountable for microeconomic issues and policies in the economics department. There's written on so many things in the Australian newspaper among them, and of course he's also looked in the past at infrastructure economics in particular. So Henry Ergas is on the line right now. Come on in, Henry. I think we can all hear you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organising this and inviting me. I really wanted to touch on 3 issues, some of which have already been canvassed, so I hope you'll excuse me if I do that. The first issue, you could perhaps call it a benefit of age, if there are any benefits of age. And in this case, benefit of age is that I lived through the energy price shock of the 1970s, and at the time was quite involved with the impact of those energy price shocks on the OECD economy. And what was very clear was that the energy price shock of the mid and then late 1970s had, amongst other things, a devastating impact on investment levels, capital stock, activity. And that was really because they had 3 effects which played themselves out in the early 1980s. So the first effect was that they led to the accelerated scrapping and decommissioning of otherwise highly productive energy-intensive plant and equipment. And so the capital stock, the effective capital stock, shrank very quickly in the wake of the energy price shock, and that reduced output and productivity. The second effect the energy price shock had, which was equally significant, was that they reduced capacity utilization throughout the private sector, and they did so essentially because the cost of utilizing capacity increased, and so the optimal level of capacity utilization declined, and with the decline in capacity utilization, you had foregone economies of scale, which also had productivity levels and productivity growth. And the third factor that was at work as a result of the energy price shock was that the effective cost of introducing new plant and equipment increased because obviously new plant and equipment, when it's put to use, required energy, and energy had become more expensive. In other words, there was a complementarity, economists say, between capital and energy, and that complementarity of energy and capital meant that the overall impact of the energy shocks on investment was very, very material. And in fact, if you look at what happened in that period of the late 1970s and 1980s, because the energy price shock affected virtually every economy, every advanced economy in particular, we had a correlated decline in investment and productivity. And it was only really subsequent to that, when energy prices reverted towards more normal levels, assisted in the United States in particular by the deregulation of natural gas, that productivity levels and growth rates recovered. And so we had what economists call a natural experiment, which showed very stark the effect of energy prices on productivity levels and growth rates. And of course in Australia, it's we've administered, as have the other advanced economies, and this too is a correlated economy, we've administered very large energy sector in Australia. Electricity and gas costs as an input into manufacturing have risen by about 85 to 90% over the last 15 years, which makes them comparable to the energy price shocks globally of the 1970s, and hence, as you'd expect, our current levels and gas rates have been adversely affected. That brings me to the second point, which was also raised by Gary and David Pearl, which is that, yes, the level of investment matters, but its quality is also crucial. Quality of investment and its composition is every bit as significant as its absolute level. And what we've seen in recent years is a significant deterioration in the quality of investment, particularly in the public sector. And massive growth in public sector investment, most of which would fail any sensible cost-benefit test. And the result of that, of course, is that we not only crowd out private investment, but we reduce the productivity of capital overall. And just to give you one example of that impact or return on this public sector investment, the NBN, which Labour repeatedly said would earn a commercial rate of return, will by the end of this year have taken asset write-downs on its regulatory asset base, which equal the total, Labour said, building the NBN would require. In other words, the total amount that Labour estimated would require to build the NBN has already been. Now, the Hilmer reform, Gary said, intended to put that to an end, but what's been put to an end effectively are the Hilmer reforms. That leads me to the third and final point I'd like to make, which is this. Both David and Gary have mentioned the crowding out by public sector growth and the growth in public spending and employment, the crowding out of private sector growth and private sector employment. But I don't think it's only a resource crowding out. In other words, that if a dollar is used for the public sector, that dollar of resources isn't available for the private sector for employment. Rather, it's also what you could call an attitudinal crowding out. And by that, what I mean is really simply this, is that when 2 out of 3 jobs are created in the public sector, broadly defined, then you don't only affect directly the resources available from the private sector, you also affect the expectations and culture of workplaces, because they are set in the competitive economy they will be set by the expectations and culture of public sector workplaces, or public sector funded workplaces. And what we're seeing throughout the Australian economy is the unrestrained growth of an adversarial workplace culture, which is dominated by expectations of entitlement. The right to disconnect, the right to work from home, the right to be treated with kids' rights at all times, the right to sue one's employer whenever any of those expectations is disappointed, all of which compounds the rigidities that are already introduced by our industrial relations system. And with the entrenchment of those entitlements in the public sector, making the private sector less attractive as the source of employment, and especially making small businesses less attractive, that compounds the decline in the private sector, makes small business creation slower and less successful or less likely to succeed, which makes it overall harder to maintain competition and economic dynamism. Let me just make one last point, if I may, which is this. I think every generation has a policy variable that it faces as a choice, or an economic outcome that it faces as a choice. And those of you who are old enough will remember Ted Evans saying many years ago when he was Treasury Secretary that unemployment was a policy decision. In Australia, unemployment, he said, was a policy decision. And nowadays, productivity is the economic outcome that is an outcome of choice, an outcome that policy in many, many ways shapes and controls. And that's really the fundamental fact we have to grapple with. It's a great pity that we don't have for productivity the range of terms that we have for inflation. As some of you may know, economists talk about price stability, creeping inflation, galloping inflation, and then hyperinflation. Well, we should have those terms for productivity, but what we've done is gone in reverse. We've gone from galloping or hyper-productivity growth, galloping, to creeping, to stable, and now to disproductivity, which is the equivalent of disinflation. And the only way we'll get out of it is by making policy choices that Gary and David have so eloquently. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. You're with the special broadcast on Sky News around the country from the committee rooms inside Parliament House, Canberra. And the reason for this is an alternative roundtable, one which is broadcast to the roundtable taking place by the government, the Treasurer, the Prime Minister holding theirs. This before we do move to that open discussion, I do want to bring in one more speaker, if that is okay. And that person is the former chair of not only the ABC, but also of Deutsche Bank and the ASX. Miles Newman is one of Australia's leading business people, now involved in a range of different matters, perhaps not least, which is the National Father's Day giveaway, which I thought was rather an interesting and productive use of this time. We've got more people coming into the room now. We'll certainly go to them once we move on. Morrison, thank you so much for being with us.
When I was trying to collect my thoughts as to what I was going to say, I thought if this was to be held in Ireland, in Dublin, Senator O'Callaghan would be thinking in his introductory remarks, well, I'm not sure I'd be wanting to start from where we are. But we are where we are, and unsurprisingly you're going to hear the same themes repeated, but I make no apologies for that because I think they bear repeating. I should say that after 50 years of so-called social democratic reforms, Australians are now less free, less equal, less productive, and they're more divided. Indeed, notwithstanding the profound technological changes that have occurred over the past 60 years, productivity growth is where it was 60 years ago. And what's more, homelessness is at a 25-year high, and the decline in real per capita household disposable income has been amongst the worst in the advanced world. Meanwhile, Australians wait for someone to expose the emperors who have no clothes. Sadly, Treasurer Jim Chalmers is one such emperor. Dr. Chalmers promotes Chinese-style socialism under the banner stakeholder capitalism. His mastery of spin uses the title humanising capital.
Team to win this one.
But the philosophy, is the same. Dr. Chalmers believes that businesses should be judged on their corporate social responsibility, not just financial metrics. He advocates, quote, the transformation of the welfare state into a managerial utopia with the government in collaboration with superannuation funds, acting as benevolent resource allocators.
I will bring peace to this
which
universe,
autocratic,
no matter the cost.
technocratic elites will manage all aspects of society. What could possibly go wrong? And that means there will be more naked emperors. Clearly, central planning is his utopian ideal. It champions horizontal fiscal equalisation, which encourages states like Victoria and Tasmania to be handsomely compensated for bad policy through federal tax redistribution. This consolidates the power of the government collective, and I think begs the question that we need more states to inject some competitive tension into our nation. Naturally, smaller government, market-driven resource allocation, more flexible employment and environmental laws, and a reduction in immigration levels are off the table in the unproductive round table which is occurring down below. But like it or not, productivity is about living standards per person. And I think we should bear in mind that declining education standards play a role here, as well as increasing levels of unskilled immigration, making the task of productivity improvement even more difficult to achieve. So too, the size of government. It's not well understood there are 2.6 million public servants at federal, state and local government units. And they have nothing, very little to do, if anything, with productivity. And like their mission to employ more, their mission is essentially to employ more public servants, to undermine business efficiency by extending sustainability obligations, drafting DEI legal requirements, and even considering pondering laws to penalise pedestrians who fail to walk on the left-hand side of the footpath. Now, both major parties ignore international competitiveness. They support renewable energy policies, which in just 20 years, as we've already heard, have turned the nation's electricity prices from one of the world's cheapest to amongst the most expensive. So I think we can forget status. Futile net zero 2050 targets do nothing for the planet, but they do limit productivity growth, they encourage rent seekers, and they distort efficient capital allocation. And with so many frictions, Australia is experiencing a record number of business closures, particularly among small and medium-sized enterprises, and none of that should surprise anyone. Nevertheless, despite all, Australia's productivity growth, slow though it is, has been greatly assisted by an increasing participation rate and favourable terms of trade. But those tailwinds are now starting to abate. Participation rates are probably at their peak. I think it's hard to see there will be more women entering the workforce to materially change that. And Australia's terms of trade have also benefited greatly from the enormous from the past 4 decades, really, enormous growth out of China. But Beijing now faces extraordinary and intractable, in my view, social and economic problems, which are the predictable consequence of the system's authoritarian rigidity. And as China's growth declines, so too its demand for natural resources. And that will have a direct impact on Australian producers receiving lower prices, and ultimately that will reflect its way into declining GDP growth, putting additional pressure on stretched government budgets and work efforts. Now, for too long, all Australian governments have hoped for the best rather than prepare for the predicament. And it's why the company tax rate has gone from being amongst the lowest in the OECD to the second highest. It's also why personal marginal tax rates are comparatively high and kick in at relatively low levels. Payroll taxes remain a barrier to employment. Now, with moderating tailwinds, foreign investors are viewing Australia as becoming too risky. Japanese and Korean investors are increasingly of that view. And we've seen firms like Kraft Heinz and Chevron selling out. Now, particularly concerning, I think, is the stark decline in Australian R&D over the past 15 years. It represents only 1.66% of GDP, which is well below the OECD average of 2.7%. And it's a poor omen for productivity and for future generations who will bear that cost. I think we can all conclude that the evidence is in. And while Dr. Chalmers' economic reform roundtable, quote, aims to build a consensus on ways to improve productivity, economic resilience and strengthen budget stability, and quote, given the mindset of many of the chosen participants, it is unlikely to do more than to build the productivity. So I think having identified the issues, the problems, that gives us at least a roadmap as to how to go about solutions. But any sustainable lift in productivity will have to await the time when it is
I am ready to put on a show!
for the right to do the right.
Thanks so much, Morris. Really appreciate that. So here we are in the roundtable, the alternative roundtable, as it were, the real productivity roundtable, as compared with downstairs. Just out of that downstairs productivity and economic roundtable, Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Treasurer, joins us now. Ted, many thanks for your time. You've heard some of the conversation, in particular just right while Morris was chatting here. Some of the things we've heard already, a measure that should be taken from David Pearl. A band and bracket rate that should be basically abolished to improve productivity. Federal government spending should be reduced by 4 percentage points of GDP. Number 3 was basically to basically limit the number of new entrants to only those with profound disabilities. And number 4 was basically to scrap the net zero aspirations of this nation as a whole. So there's some of the actual things that we have heard today as real solutions to Australia's productivity crisis. Tell me what you're hearing downstairs. Are those sort of ideas being thrown about the place?
No. I think the key thing from those first 3 you mentioned,
Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man!
To where the real problem lies, and that is the government has to stop spending. Because if it doesn't, then it's going to only go after more taxes, and the only tax they're really relying on is income tax increases. That's entirely what they think is going to close the gap of the deficits. So we'll find out tomorrow, which is the day that the other round table will be discussing taxes, what the government's approach is to. When it comes to issues of energy, it has been raised. But I've shared this with the other round table, so I'll share it here. My concern is they are defining the wrong problem to solve. The problem to solve is to accelerate the rollout of a failed energy policy. Because that's what they're focused on. They're trying to get skills, development and capital to accelerate the rollout of an energy policy which is making Australians poorer, our economy weaker, industries collapsing. That is not the problem to solve. The problem to solve is how we ensure we've got the cheapest, most reliable grid possible. And we can decarbonise. But they're not talking about it. And I think that's a big difference from the summary, at least, Ross, that you just provided.
The Cosmos heals, right? So we've got to a point now where we can really
I am ready to put on a show.
What I really do want to have coming back my way are points like David Pearl's made. In other words, what are the things that need to be done? I think we've identified the problem. I think everybody understands what the problems are. Lack of economic growth. Too much government spend, energy prices are way too high, taxes are way too high. All of these things.
Don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man!
That's becoming increasingly less flexible. So my point is, they're the problem. They understand what they are. What are the solutions?
I am born anew.
Go if you like. Nick Cater, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Sky. Thank you for organising this. We would pick up on something Ted said and Henry. on this thing about capital formation. So, Henry, you very eloquently drew the link between the energy price shock of the 1970s and the decline in the capital stock. I wonder if now things are considerably worse because the current government, has taken on such a large responsibility in the allocation of that capital, but not to say the misallocation of that capital. It's going, as Ted points out, to a very unproductive use and one that in fact lowers productivity by pushing energy prices up still further. So to put that in simple terms, that's the recommendation we should make, to end subsidies in every form.
So there is one. I want to go now to Mike Newman, who's on the line. In Japan, I understand, Intervale Investments, the founder of that, been in investment banking for more than a couple of decades, and was also a senior trade and investment commissioner for North Asia for the New South Wales government. Mike, I think you're on the line right now, so I hope we can hear you.
I'm out of control. Healing power.
We're trying to get him on the line. We're trying to get him on the line right now. So
don't mess with the amazing Spider-Man.
How's that?
How's Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Senator Canada, and for this opportunity to participate. I've been in Japan for 25 years. I've had an association for over 4 decades, and in that time, this is the first time I've heard Japanese corporations mention the word sovereign risk. That has never happened before. They really have looked at us as such a safe pair of hands. But I think when you look at the retroactive application of the safeguard mechanism and even ever more onerous regulations around red tape, green tape, black tape and so on, they see that as a disincentive for business investment. Now, even though our Chevron CEO, Mike Wirth, said the other day that Australia is becoming no longer really investable, several months prior to that, the senior vice president of JERA, one of Japan's largest LNG businesses, Mr. Nishizawa, said that unless Australia addresses its onerous regulatory frameworks, they'll have no choice but to look elsewhere from 2030. Now, apart from the words themselves, culturally, you need to understand that the Japanese are very, very polite people who rarely express their opinions this openly. So in some respects, this voicing the frustration should be seen as a DEFCON 2. It's worth noting also that the Japanese and the Koreans run all of their energy transition out of their economic development agencies, METI and MOTI. The environmental agencies play absolutely no part because the government realises that unless you have industry leading the charge, that you are not going to have a very successful economy. And having said that, we only have to look at the very recent Fraser Institute Global Mining Attraction